Final Fantasy VIII was released in 1999, just 2 years after the release of Final Fantasy VII, meaning that it had some very large shoes to fill, with Final Fantasy VII not only being a massively popular game, but also being the game that popularized Japanese role-playing games in the West. So starting with Final Fantasy VIII, the Final Fantasy series started to be developed as something proven to have a global appeal. Compared to the translation of Final Fantasy VII, the translation of Final Fantasy VIII appears, at least on the surface, to be a lot more solid, with less obvious mistakes, which results in a gameplay experience wherein the translation itself isn't getting in the way. However, the main issue people have had with the translation is how it depicts the character of Squall, with a lot of players feeling that the English version is somewhat off-putting or unpleasant, the sort of major point of argument being his signature catchphrase, whatever, which appears on numerous occasions during the course of the game, all the while the Japanese text has a number of other more nuanced lines that might portray his character a bit differently. As my second Final Fantasy game, Final Fantasy VIII holds a very special place in my heart, and it's also the second Final Fantasy game I actually played in Japanese back when I was still studying the language. And now that I'm actively studying Final Fantasy games, both as someone who runs a Final Fantasy YouTube channel and as an aspiring academic, this video is a part of an ongoing project for me to better understand the game and the localization process and to become an expert in the field, all the while inviting all of you to come along with me so that we can learn together. In order to do this, I will be playing both versions of the game and adding the English text into the Japanese version in order to compare them. If you speak Japanese in any shape or form, feel free to give your own input, and don't worry if you feel like your interpretation is different from mine. And if you're learning Japanese or just interested in the language, don't hesitate to ask questions that might help further your understanding of the language. I mean, a part of my time studying Japanese was spent playing games like Final Fantasy VIII, and it made the whole process a lot more fun. Even though one of my teachers in Japan was convinced that I would never use a word like jikan ashiku, which means time compression, after I had written it on the blackboard in class. But actually, compared to a lot of Final Fantasy games, I think that Final Fantasy VIII has a lot of useful everyday vocabulary, especially because a part of it takes place in this sort of modern, high school-inspired environment. Just one more thing before we get started. If this is something that you want more of, or if this is a project that you would want to see continued, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video, leaving a comment, and maybe even clicking the bell or sharing the video, just to give me some indication that this is something people might find value in, because I want to spend my time creating something people can actually use. But with all of that out of the way, I think it's time for us to dive right in, so I present to you Whatever, a tale of translation. I hope you enjoy. So here we have our first lines of dialogue in the game, as Katowaki-sensei says, "Daijoubu da ne?" literally meaning, "You're alright, right?" or "You're okay, right?" The English translation reads, "How are you feeling?" which perhaps isn't exactly what it says in the Japanese version, but translation is an art form in and of itself. So this is probably just an attempt to go for something that sounds a little bit more natural, while at the same time retains the meaning of the original. Also, if you have some Japanese under your belt, we already have two words you might be familiar with. The first one being daijoubu, meaning something like being okay, and then probably one of the most famous words in the Japanese language, sensei, as in Katowaki-sensei. It's often translated as teacher or master, so you might be thinking that the Japanese version is actually referring to Dr. Katowaki as a teacher, since they are at school, but doctors are also commonly referred to as sensei, sensei being someone who is skilled in a certain art or craft, so Katowaki-sensei is still primarily a doctor. As a response to her question, whether we're all right, we get to choose between "ah," which means yeah, and "hitai ga itamu," which means "my forehead hurts." And we're going to be acting a bit tough and replying with "ah," meaning yeah. And yeah, as you might be starting to suspect, we could spend a ridiculous amount of time meticulously going over every single line, but we will try to find a good balance between saying too much and saying too little, just so we can sort of focus more on the really juicy parts of difference, if there are any. But of course, it's also just interesting to see to what extent the English translation follows along with the Japanese, even though it might not be as exciting as finding some key points of difference that would revolutionize the way we think about the game. はい。あんまり無茶するんじゃないよ。Meaning something like, don't take it too far. But there's no actual mention of next time in the Japanese version. 目つきもしっかりしてきたね。もう大丈夫そうだ。自分の名前言ってみな。Which means something like, you look like you're alright. How about trying to say your name for me? Which sounds a little bit less blunt than the English version. You should be fine. Say your name for me. So in the Japanese version, I might say that Katowaki-sensei is exhibiting a more appropriate level of care for someone who has just gotten slashed across the face. And of course, we're going with Squall. 訓練の時は少し手加減したら、そのうちとんでもないことになるよ。サイファーに言ってください。Which would usually be translated as, please tell that to Cypher. Which again might make the English translation a little bit less blunt. But the actual thing that I would mention here is that here we can see that the size of the text box for the Japanese and the English version is different. And that's important because a lot of the time you hear that these early translators had to deal with severe limitations regarding space because Japanese takes a lot less space usually than English. But here we can see that they were free to mold the size of the text boxes to some degree. あの子はね、何を言っても無駄ってやつだね。相手しなければいいんじゃないの？逃げるわけにはいかないから。格好つけたい年頃なんだね。まあ、ほどほどにしておきな。さてさて、あんたの指導教官は？キスティス先生だね。連絡するからちょっと待ってなさい。So Quistis is one of those names from Final Fantasy that people have had some difficulty deciding how to pronounce because they never actually hear it said in the game. We can see that the Japanese pronunciation is Kistis, but that doesn't really mean that the English pronunciation has to be exactly the same. And now World of Final Fantasy seems to have confirmed Quistis as the quote-unquote correct pronunciation of her name. キスティス、あんたのサイト引き取りに来てね。はいはい。怪我は大丈夫だね。まあ、後が残るだろうけど。そうそう、じゃあ、早く来ておくれ。Squall, また会えたね。Meaning Squall, so we were able to meet again. So this mysterious girl has apparently snuck into the infirmary just to tell Squall a single line through a piece of solid glass before presumably just sneaking back out. And Quistis is apparently arriving a little bit later, since he doesn't run into the girl on her way out. That was just me trying to imagine her Japanese voice. For fun. もう絶対あんたがサイファーだと思ったわ。さあ、行こうよ。実試験今日に決まったんだから。Which means something like, now let's go, because the practical exam has been decided for today. If you compare it to the English, come on let's go, today is the field exam, I feel like the Japanese version is hinting a little bit more at the spontaneity of this test, because it's not something that they knew about in advance, but rather it's something that just gets suddenly decided. ねえ、スコール、何か悩んでることはないの？別に。As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, in the English version, Squall's famous catchphrase is whatever. But if you were to ask me what his catchphrase was in Japanese, I would say it was this 別に, which means not really or not especially. So Quistis just asked Squall whether there wasn't something he was worrying about, which Squall replies to by saying 別に, not really. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the whatevers in the English version had something to do with 別に or variations of 別に. So I'm going to start a 別に counter for a sort of quantitative analysis to see whether Squall actually says 別に as many times as I feel he does, and then once he starts saying whatever, we can also initiate a whatever counter, and the two of them can have some sort of ultimate showdown in the end. So look forward to that. あはは。何がそんなにおかしい？おかしい？違う違う。嬉しいの。ツイートを少しだけ理解できた。だから嬉しいってだけ。俺はそんなに単純じゃない。じゃあ、話しなさいよ。あなたのことをもっと聞かせてちょうだい。先生には関係ないだろう。So, I'm going to end it with our first look at Balam Garden, one of the most appealing locations in the entire history of Final Fantasy, I feel. We of course haven't gotten very far, but now the future is sort of in your hands. I'm counting on you, the viewer, to let me know whether you want me to continue with this series or not. And if you want me to continue, is there anything you would like me to change about the format or the way I'm presenting this information? I'm hoping that we can set up a little bit of community surrounding this project, so don't forget to leave a comment down below, telling me what you thought of the video. Also, please share with the rest of us if you feel like you have some insight into the translation that I didn't mention or go into. And if you're studying Japanese and have questions about some of the lines, don't hesitate to ask, and I can do my best to help you out. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for a lot more Final Fantasy content. But until next time, I leave you with some pleasant bird sounds.